I know it's only the end of October, but I'm already thinking ahead to next month. When I was teaching, I always tried to plan ahead, especially this time of the year. There were so many fun things that I wanted to do around the holidays, and I knew I had to plan ahead to fit everything in. So I figured I'd get a jump on Thanksgiving with this episode in case you feel the same way. This week, we're talking about how you can take one very special Thanksgiving book to teach reading comprehension, vocabulary, writing, and STEM. So let's get started. I love Thanksgiving. The turkey, cooking in the oven, baking pies, burning the rolls. Unfortunately, that seems to be one of my family traditions since I burn them every single year. It's no joke. I seem to do that every single year. In fact, it's like a family tradition at this point. My kids just expect burned rolls at Thanksgiving. But when I was a kid, the thing that I loved the most was the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade on television. Looking at all the balloons and waiting for Santa to show up at the end. So how can you take all of this excitement and turn it into a meaningful project in your classroom? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today with one of my favorite picture books called Balloons Over Broadway by Melissa Sweet. If you've never read this book, it's the story of Tony Sarg, who was the creator of the giant balloons that we all love in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. So in the book, we learn that as a young child, Tony loved puppets. He began his career as a puppeteer, and eventually he moved to New York City, where his puppets would perform on Broadway. While R.H. Macy, that was the owner of the Macy's department store, heard about these puppets and about Tony Sarg, and so he hired him to make puppets for his store windows. Well, if you know anything about Macy's in New York City, they're very famous for their huge display windows, especially around the holidays. And so Tony did just that. He created these beautiful animated display windows with his puppets. And so R.H. Macy was so impressed that he told Tony he wanted to create a special holiday parade for his employees. And so he asked Tony to create this parade with his puppets. Well, over time, Tony worked to perfect the parade, and he noticed that the people in the back couldn't see the puppets, so he wanted everybody to be able to enjoy it, and that's when he got the idea to make the floating puppets on strings that we all know and love as those giant parade balloons. So Balloons Over Broadway is such a great book for so many activities that you can do with your class. First of all, it's the story of Tony Sarg's life, so it's great for teaching kids about nonfiction and biographies. So after reading this book to my class, we talk about what a biography is, and then it teaches us about the life of a famous person. It was a great book to teach about character traits because Tony was so creative and hardworking, and he was really determined to make these balloons work. So that was one of the things that we would do with this book was talk about character traits and the kind of person that Tony was. It's also a great book if you want to teach kids about making text connections. Lots of kids are going to have connections of watching the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade at home with their family. It might remind them of good memories of having Thanksgiving dinner with their family or with their friends, or they might be reminded of a puppet show that they've seen in person or on TV. So it's a good book to show kids how relating a story to their own life can help them comprehend the story a little bit better. I had a writing template that I would give the kids to help them write about a connection that they had with the story, so that we could link reading comprehension with writing. I'll link that in the show notes. And then another skill that you can teach with this book is problem and solution. The book shows all the different problems that Tony ran into when he was trying to develop his giant balloons. So it gives you a great opportunity to talk about some of the different problems that Tony had in the book and how he solved those problems. This book also lends itself well to teaching lots of new vocabulary words to kids. They're going to hear words like immigrant, marionette, spectator. There's all kinds of new words in this book. And anytime you can teach new vocabulary through a picture book, it's better because kids are learning the words in context, and so they'll understand them better, which will make them remember them more. Whenever you introduce kids to a new read aloud, I always think it's a great idea to find a way to include some writing in your lessons. In this story, one of Tony's first jobs was to design the Macy's window displays with animated puppets, and Tony called his window Macy's Wondertown. So a fun writing prompt that I had my kids do was to design and write about their own window display. We'd work together in whole group to brainstorm some different windows that they could design, and then I'd find pictures online of different window displays and show those to the kids to help spark their imagination. In fact, there's a bunch of YouTube videos that show some of the actual Macy's windows that you can show your class too. I'll link those in the show notes. And then another way you can use Balloons Over Broadway to teach writing is to show kids how to write a biography or, a report about a famous person. And yes, even first grade kids can do this. In first grade, one of the writing standards is to write informative text where they name a topic and supply some facts about that topic. You just have to make it simple enough so that kids can do it on their own. We used a very simple writing template that I'll link to, and the kids wrote about where Tony lived, what he was like as a child, and a few simple facts that they had learned about Tony in the book. And then finally, if you want to incorporate some STEM activities into your lesson plans, you can take advantage of this story and have your kids build their own parade balloons. We did this in my room, and so what we did first was we watched a really short video on YouTube. I think it was about 4 or 5 minutes long, and it showed a bunch of different balloons in the Macy's parade, so the kids could really see what they looked like. I think there was Paw Patrol and Bluey and SpongeBob and a whole bunch of others. And so then we made a list together of some different ideas of balloons that the kids could make. I gave them all a little booklet that they were going to use to plan their project. On the first page, they had to design their balloon. So they drew it in their planning book and they labeled all the different parts of the balloon. Then on the next page, the kids had to make a list of materials that they were going to need for the project. They listed things like a balloon, construction paper, string, craft sticks, stuff like that. In the book, Balloons Over Broadway, it showed Tony planning his balloons and how he would glue different materials that he'd be using to his planning boards. So the kids had a page in their planning book where they glued samples of the materials that they planned on using. I had sent a letter home to the parents asking for donations for some of the different supplies that we'd need for their projects. I gathered all sorts of craft materials together like string and construction paper, different colored balloons, craft sticks, stuff like that, and sorted it all into trays. I put all the trays on my guided reading table, and then the kids could get what they needed from the trays as they were working. So then after all the planning was done, it was time for the kids to build their parade balloons. They used real balloons and drew faces on them and added construction paper for clothes or whatever. They turned out so cute. And then finally, when they were all finished, they wrote the steps for how they built their balloons. So we took about a week to do all these activities in our room. I liked being able to take one read aloud and do so much with it. And I used my Balloons Over Broadway resource that I have in my TPT store to help guide it all. So just to recap, you can use the book Balloons Over Broadway to teach about informational text, reading comprehension, text connections, vocabulary, writing activities like biographies, and how-to writing. And you can incorporate STEM by building your own parade balloons. If you want to try some of these activities in your room, I have an entire resource in my TPT store with everything I mentioned in today's episode, and I'll put the link to that in the show notes. Okay, friends, that's it for today. So until next time, remember to make learning feel like play. See you next week.